يعني بعض الناس تظن أن الليبرالية هي الديمقراطية، وهذا أيضا يعني مفهوم خاطئ، لأن هناك أنظمة قد تكون غير ليبرالية وأيضا هي أنظمة ديمقراطية. ما نحاول أن نفعله الآن هو أن نصنع نموذج مختلف نستفيد به من التجارب الأخرى، سواء في الدول الغربية أو في أي مكان، أو حتى بعض الدول مثل تركيا أو البرازيل، أو الدول اللي حصل فيها تحول ديمقراطي زي دول أمريكا اللاتينية. نبحث عن نموذج وصيغة تناسب المصريين، صيغة تجعل الديمقراطية واقع وثقافة، وتجعل المصريين يحبون الديمقراطية. ونحن يعني سنتعب جدا في ذلك، لأن إرساء ثقافة جديدة وجعلها سلوك وجعلها منهج للحياة هو أمر ليس بالسهل، ولكن يعني هذه هي سنة الحياة.
I start to talk about society and how always there is a new resistance, like internal resistance inside any community for change. And this resistance can be with and can be against, you know. And in the meantime, like that understanding for democracy, especially with that different political factions in Egypt, it is some like there could never like the liberals, the leftists, everybody have his definitions for democracy. So the liberals have his definition, the socialists have his definitions, the democratic have definition for democracy, and the Islamic has his definition. We know that okay, but most of them they think that the liberal, the people who's liberal, they are the people who's democratic. You know, but we know that there is some people who's not liberal, but they are democracy. That is how he defined it. But now he said that, like we try to find some solutions to promote democracy for sure, but we need an like a complete example or a good examples can fit our community. Like our community is different than the Western community, their cultures and their thinking and their idea. So to find the good examples, we need Sweden, we need all the countries that they got in this period and they wanted to be a democratic countries. So we were gonna use their experience to find our type of democracy, which or our definitions for our community, where everybody inside it can fit inside it, but also depend of the understanding of democracy for people. But we need so much work to make this democracy to be as a culture, to make it in fact something in the head of all these Egyptians, where they can love democracy, you know, with our definitions of in our community, which we gonna build by your experiences.
So we are now joined by Stéphane Lacroix. He is professor in political science in the Paris University Sciences Po. And his work focuses on Islam in politics in the Middle East. And Shadi Hamid, director of research at Brookings Institution, Brookings Doha, and he's a fellow of Saban Center in Middle East Policy. And some of you might recognize him from Al Jazeera, because since day one he's been commenting on the events in the Middle East for Al Jazeera in Qatar. And if we start with you, Shadi Hamid, you were actually in Cairo. You were in Tahrir Square too when it all happened. What was your sort of the strongest memory from that time?
Right, sure. Thank you. So I was in Tahrir Square the night Mubarak stepped down, and it was absolutely incredible. It's kind of hard to describe in words, but you know, later that night, watching Egyptians, you really got the sense that this was the first time they had really experienced true unfettered freedom in decades. And in terms of the euphoria, the excitement, people were in the streets celebrating, dancing, and Egypt had been absolutely transformed. Now, I think that's an important touchstone for us here, because since then, there's been a shift in mood. And Mustafa touched on this a little bit. But that optimism, people are still optimistic, but as Mustafa outlined, there are a number of concerns and worries moving forward. But I think it's worth noting from the get-go that people shouldn't have unrealistic expectations, because democratic transitions, even in the best of circumstances, are notoriously messy, uncertain, and unpredictable. And I think that's what we're going to have to be prepared for in the case of not just Egypt, but other countries in the region. It might be a slight exaggeration to call what's going on right now in Egypt a counter-revolution, but there are some counter-revolutionary elements. As we know, the military is not a pro-democracy organization, but they're the ones who are responsible for overseeing the transition. So that's not the most ideal environment for democracy in Egypt to grow. I always found the emphasis on how the military was the savior of the people, and if you were watching Al Jazeera at that point, you might remember the chants that were coming from Tahrir Square, the people and the army hand in hand. I found that to be an odd chant to emphasize, because everyone was at least slightly aware that the military had been the backbone of the old regime and had been responsible for keeping Mubarak in power for such a long time. Kind of moving a little bit to where we are now, I'll just kind of emphasize, I think, what are some important things to watch as we move forward. And Stefan will talk a little bit more about this, but the role of Islamists in Egypt is very important. And today the Muslim Brotherhood is really undoubtedly the most powerful group in Egypt, with the exception of the military. And right now we're seeing a divide within the opposition between Islamists on one hand and liberals and leftists on the other. And Mustafa is involved in starting a new liberal party, and this is something that he's concerned about in my discussions with him, that how are these weaker liberal groups going to be able to compete with the much more powerful and well-established Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think it's also important to remember, I think those of us in the West had a tendency maybe to idealize the Egyptian revolution, and I think there was especially a tendency on the part of Americans to want to believe that Egyptians were on the verge of becoming pro-American liberals. They just needed the right circumstances. I don't think this is the right way to look at it. Yes, the revolution was non-ideological. I guess you could call that secular, if by secular you mean not Islamist. But at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood did play a very important role in the revolution. They tried to be a little bit behind the scenes, but there's no doubt that they were a critical party in making the revolution possible. Now, an interesting development is not just the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is relatively moderate and mainstream. If we look at the political spectrum in Egypt, secular, Islamist, or left-right, the Brotherhood is, let's say, center-right. They're a conservative party. What we're seeing, though, now is the emergence of more radical Islamist groups, the Salafis, who may not be as committed to the democratic process as the Muslim Brotherhood and the liberals and so on. So this is a big challenge that the liberals face, is how are they going to be able to compete and build new parties, because essentially they're starting from scratch. Up until now, secular parties in Egypt have been quite weak and have very small memberships. So how do you create something out of nothing? Egypt is a big country. It's not just about having a constituency in Cairo or Alexandria, but you have to go into the rural areas and into all of Egypt and build support throughout the country. Another interesting question, I think, is, what does it mean to be liberal in the first place? And I think young Egyptians who are coming into the political scene, liberal has to mean more than just not Islamist. It has to be more than defining yourself in opposition to something else. It can't just be pro-democracy. And I think giving content to what liberalism in the Egyptian context is and will be is going to be very critical in the coming phase.
It's interesting what you're saying about these more radical groups, because the Muslim Brotherhood, as we here in the West really fear a bit, they are being criticized from the other side because they are too weak, and they are being criticized for being like spies and such from Al-Qaeda. That is a new development, sort of.
Yeah. I think you can't look at Islamist groups at monolithic as monoliths here, and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis had a sort of tactical alliance during the referendum when they both supported voting yes for the new constitutional amendments. But the fact of the matter is that the Brotherhood and the more radical Islamists don't get along. In some cases, they kind of hate each other. And Al-Qaeda has been one of the most vocal opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood, just to give one example. The Brotherhood is seen to be too much part of the system, too accommodationist. They aren't confrontational enough. They've diluted their Islamist content, and they talk too much about democracy and freedom of expression instead of really focusing on what Islamists are fundamentally supposed to be about, and that's the application of Islamic law. And what's interesting about the Brotherhood's discourse in recent months and years, you don't hear them talk a lot about the Islamic State. They're moving away from that rhetoric, and they're talking more about a civil state with an Islamic reference, which is a new kind of vocabulary. And also, they're trying to reach out to Western audiences. I don't know how much those of you in Sweden noticed this in watching the revolution unfold, but I remember actually on February 9th, I was going through different websites, and I usually wake up and I read the New York Times, and I was really surprised to see an op-ed by a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood 2 days before Mubarak stepped down. But not only that, then I switched to the Washington Post, and wow, there are two Brotherhood leaders writing two op-eds in the two most prestigious U.S. newspapers on the same day. And this really, shows us that Islamist groups like the Brotherhood, they understood how important the international factor was in making the Egyptian revolution possible. So they wanted to reach out to the U.S. and to Europe and say, listen, we're conservative, you may not agree with what we have to say, but we're not against the democratic process, and give us a chance to show, to show what we can do and how we can be part of the system. So that was, I think, a very interesting development to see.
Actually, I talked to the spokesperson, the leader of Muslim Brotherhood, yesterday, very late in the evening. Essam Al-Arian, can somebody please help me with the
Essam Al-Arian.
Yes, he's the spokesperson. And I asked him first of all about to describe the role in the democratization process in Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood.
I think Muslim Brotherhood are the most important partner in democratization of Egypt now, because it seems to be the biggest organized popular group, and it has an Islamic reference. It's very important to convince them that religion is going with democracy, compatible, not conflicting.
Why don't you have a presidential candidate then?
This is a very important question. The incoming president is not working alone. It will work with the parliament. And now this revolution reflects the power of the people, not the power of the individual, not the power of the president. And to work in the parliament is more important than